Jennifer Snest. You're watching News 24 Live. Well, I'm joined in our studio by our in-house doctor, Dr. Darren Green, and he's answering your social media questions. Hello.
Hello, hello.
Well, I have a question for you from social media. This one is about periods. This woman wants to know, I've not had my period since June last year. I did a pregnancy test and I'm not pregnant and I'm not on any contraceptives. I'm assuming she means oral contraceptives. What must I do?
Well, for some women that's a big joy,
Right.
not having their menses. However, you should definitely want to know what her normal rhythm was. And for a year to be, basically we call it amenorrhea, when you don't have any menstrual cycle.
All right.
For a period of a year. Certainly one would want to go and have a look and see what does the uterus look like. We want to look at the lining of the uterus, what we call the endometrium. And that's important to us because that lining responds to the different sex hormones that we refer to: testosterone, progesterone and estrogen. And there's a constant dynamic change in the levels of those hormones that make that lining become thicker or thinner, preparing it actually in your fertility years to house and home, obviously, a fertilized egg. So when that time of the month occurs, that lining or layer of the uterus is then sloughed, and that's when you have your menstrual cycle.
Right.
The question is then to ask for this specific patient, does she have any form of bleeding, or is it just erratic, is it irregular, or is it completely absent? Now, there are a host of medical conditions associated with amenorrhea. One of them, and a simple one that's often overlooked, is actually being underweight.
Really?
So being really, really thin and having a small, lean body mass can also lead to amenorrhea. Pregnancy is obviously the one that we're all aware of and alert to quite quickly. But if you think about it, the whole process and cycle is really dependent on the hormone levels, and the different medical conditions that affect the hormone levels particularly are things like polycystic ovarian disease, where you have cysts present in the ovaries, which then affect, obviously due to the mass effect on the ovaries, affect the amount of hormone that is produced. You also have systemic interactions. In other words, things like stress can affect your menstrual cycle. Things like your cortisol levels and your thyroid hormone have a direct bearing on your estrogen as well. So one cannot in isolation just look at this scenario where for a year she hasn't had a menstrual cycle. So we need to have a look, and I think she needs to visit a gynae rather urgently to go and see why it is that she's actually not having any symptoms.
You often hear about irregular periods. At what point do women need to see the doctor, need to see the gynae about their cycle?
Yes. So the average cycle is a 28-day cycle, and for those of you that don't know, a normal period lasts up to 5 days. The first 2 days being quite heavy, and then it tapers off, and after about 5 days it's normally done and dusted. So people that function outside of that, obviously you look at the amount of bleeding that occurs. If it carries on for a period of longer than 7 to 10 days, and it happens for certain females that they bleed for almost 2 weeks of the month, and it's really debilitating, and it affects their planning. It also affects their socializing, etc., and their exercise routines and planning around that, for example. So I think what we need to understand is the term used for irregular periods is metrorrhagia. So like a metronome determines the rhythm of music that we put on the piano, tick tock, tick tock. Metrorrhagia. If the amount of bleeding is just excessive and large amounts of blood and clots are lost, one can become anemic. So it's quite important, and that process is called menorrhagia. And it certainly can put one into a rage if you're not careful, because you can imagine that the acute blood loss or persistent blood loss rather can lead to systemic side effects of fatigue and even functional anemia, where you can't perform your normal tasks. So certainly if that pattern exists of having irregular and heavy bleeding in your periods, certainly consider seeing your doctor. It normally can be remedied by looking specifically at your hormone cycle, but also pathology of the inner lining of the uterus needs to be excluded when you have a dysfunctional uterine bleed.